welcome to the Acid Trash Jamboree, and to a segment I'm calling Underground Heroes, where I shine a spotlight on bands and projects that have been prolifically active in the shadows for many decades, rarely, if ever, aligning themselves with any set musical genres or scenes, and basically just doing whatever they want, whenever they want. So first up, I'm covering a small clutch of albums by Nocturnal Emissions, an experimental project founded by a guy named Nigel Ayers circa 1980, with his brother Danny and a woman named Caroline Kay, both of whom ended up quitting the band later on in the 80s, leaving Nocturnal Emissions ostensibly as Nigel Ayers' solo venture. Now, I'm certainly no expert on the group's history, and from what I can see, there's not an awful lot of information out there about them, so instead I'll just concentrate on what little music I have. And yeah, what better place to start than with their debut, Tissue of Lies, originally released on vinyl in 1980 via the band's own Sterile imprint. That said, the version I own is the so-called revised CD edition from a decade later. Whilst it's since had a few reissues of its own, I'm yet to hear the original mix of this album, so I've no idea how it stacks up against the 1990 version. Precisely how different it is, for starters. Whether said original is so flawed or unsatisfactory that it justified being tampered with, or whether this revised edition was completely unnecessary. So yeah, with that in mind, let's get stuck in. Now, it's not listed as being part of the original LP, but nonetheless, Apocalypse When kicks things off as they mean to go on, with dark, moody, ring-modulated synths, which give way to thin, trebly beats, backing telephone chirps and a wash of white noise. Then the following piece, You Tempt Me, consists mostly of nasty metallic scraping sounds, backed by a very quiet, lo-fi tribal beat. Along the way, we hear sparse sections with just the beat overlaid with heavily processed vocals, though the metallic noise eventually creeps back in. Yeah, very minimal stuff on the whole. Limited Holocaust engagement keeps the eerie, minimalist theme going with freeform peals of moody space synths, sounding as if they're ricocheting around some dilapidated industrial warehouse. Yeah, this is all very sparse and thin sounding. The piece never really gets too busy, and again, there's zero low end at work here, which may be bothersome to some. Next up, Down the Sink is a touch more happening, with more of those weird, processed vocals over another trebly, shuffly drum machine beat, the track sounding like some post-punk effort as remixed by robots. The next three pieces are all very brief. The second and third of these were unreleased before this revised CD came out, and in truth, they're way too slight to hold up to close scrutiny. The first one, however, Shrubbish Factory, is pretty entertaining, being a chaotic fever dream miniature of fuzz guitar and delay vocals. That said, I can't help but feel shortchanged by this severely chopped down version. Yeah, apparently the original LP version runs for over 9 minutes. Slightly more substantial is Slow Decay, which lives up to its title, comprising of slowly decaying twangs from a bass guitar, alongside occasional synth squiggles. The piece breaks into a chugging, skeletal industrial jam on a few occasions, after which Faith Invaders trudges along in a similar fashion, its industrialised shufflings obscured and obfuscated by sonic murk, whilst an angry Dalek vents its rage somewhere off in the distance. A nice idea on paper, though unfortunately this one never really goes anywhere. Apparently the closer, Backwards Man, Regressive Music, runs for 17 minutes on the original LP. As with some of the other material, it's chopped down a bit for this revised CD, but it's still the longest thing here at just under 14 minutes. In short, this one plays out like a summation of everything that's gone before, with layers of free-form garbled voices and treble-heavy metallic noise scraping, morphing into another extended section of lo-fi, shuffling skeleton jamming. This is overlaid with chaotic guitar fuzz, which gets increasingly nasty and slimy, like the audio equivalent of wading through a sewer, before things simmer down again as we near the end. So yeah, Tissue of Lies is a very strange and alienating record overall, even by early 80s industrial standards. Granted, as I said, this revised edition came out in 1990, but the core sound is still very much of the 80s, not a million miles away from some of the stuff Robert Turman was doing around about the same time, albeit not quite as satisfying. Yeah, whilst there's some good stuff on offer, it's all very bleak and cold, and as I've said several times now, very minimalistic, barely qualifying as entertainment in places, so it's certainly something you've got to be in the mood for. For me, it's cryptic to the point of impenetrability. Yeah, I've literally no idea what any of it is supposed to represent or stand for. So perhaps the best way to sum it up is to say it unravels like a monochromatic, fuzzy fever dream and leave it at that. Okay, so the next one I have is Drowning in a Sea of Bliss, first released as a vinyl LP in 1983. The track list on this CD reissue from Touch names 18 individual pieces, 10 from the A-side of the original and 8 from the B-side. Though in fact, they're indexed as 2 seamless suites of chaos, so yeah, I'm not even going to try to work out what's what. What I will say, though, is that things kick off with terrifyingly feral primate screams, after which we move through a succession of fuzzed-out, fractured beats and blown-out synth sonorities. Things do quieten down every now and then, only to reveal some disturbing looped soundbite or other festering away beneath the surface, before blasting in again with painful mic screeching, juxtaposed against creepy, Sparky's Magic Piano type vocoded jollity. As the first half draws to its conclusion, we hear menacing helicopters droning overhead, whilst Ayers and Kay mess about with some bins down a dirty back alley, things eventually concluding with flatulent synth gurgles and wheezing loops, overlaid with enraged Donald Duck vocals. Overall, the second half is much less dense and noisy, mostly moving through a succession of pieces with more palatable and even danceable rhythms. Yeah, along the way, we hear what sounds like a school choir practice, synced up to the band's trademark drum machine shuffling, an approximation of a minimalist cluster-type mood piece, groovy, industrial hip-hop beats, pulsing occultist tribalism, and a gurgling, tape-mangled Kraftwerk jam over a sampled funk break, before things finish in grotty, proto-dungeon synth territory. So yeah, it's unpredictable to say the least. In truth, though, that's only a brief synopsis of what's really going on here. Yeah, if you're willing to take the challenge, Drowning in a Sea of Bliss is one of those records you just have to experience for yourself, as descriptions only get you so far with this kind of stuff, particularly regarding the first half. And yeah, as I said before, eventually it becomes futile even trying to follow along with the individual titles given for the parts of each extended suite. So yeah, instead it's better to just be taken along for the ride. On to The World Is My Womb, which initially came out on LP and cassette in 1987, before getting a CD issue from Soleilmoon in 1999. Whilst she's noted as having left Nocturnal Emissions a few years prior, Caroline Kay does actually feature here, alongside the co-founder of the aforementioned Touch label, John Wozencroft, who's responsible for the electronic reprocessing of the assorted gamelan sounds that crop up throughout the album. And yeah, right away we hear his work on the opener Tripod of Immortality, with said gamelan instruments chiming away like church bells, juxtaposed against the sound of sea waves lapping at a beach. So yeah, much more relaxed start to this album compared to the other two, though I can still detect some ominous elements just off in the distance which become ever more prevalent as things progress. Before that though, Sealing a Phase offers up a bit more of that wonky, proto-dungeon synth, with an ever-circling, melancholic motif, providing the backing for the first of several stretches of wordy, poetic narration. The religious spook factor then really comes to the fore on Clear Bells, with some nightmarishly liminal frequencies embedded in its imposing, churchy drone, whilst Light in Our Darkness is a more rhythmic construction, with a gloomy vocal refrain straight out of some ancient mass, given the minimalist looping treatment, alongside delicate wisps of an angelic choir. Jangled Senses returns us briefly to that strange liminal zone, with disturbingly piercing, ultra-echoed bell tones chiming over a stumbling modal piano theme, before the neo-medieval dungeon synth of Vegetation Flesh waltzes in with its crunchy, distorted percussion embellishments. As you'd expect, the following Vegetation narration features more spoken word shenanigans over a warm, earthy drone, before moving into peaceful birdsong, a tribal pulse, and yet more early doors dungeon synth, with the theme from the preceding track given an altogether more airy, fantastical treatment. Then, as the album nears its end, we find the meditative and ethereal Shankini Nadi, the gloomy piano minimalism and warbly vocal loops of bird position, and finally Blended Senses, which reprises the piano theme from Jangled Senses and sports a third portion of narration. So yeah, this is a strange album, in that it's simultaneously rather dated sounding, very much in keeping with the contemporaneous efforts of the whole post-industrial World Serpent crew, whilst also sounding weirdly up to date. Yeah, you could stick this out tomorrow and have it slot in pretty nicely with the current crop of dungeon synth twiddlers. In truth, though, The World Is My Womb seemed a bit thin and inconsequential when I first got it about 5 or so years ago. But having since paid close attention to it for this video, I find its esoteric, quasi-liturgical atmosphere to be weirdly intoxicating. We finish this mini-investigation of the Nocturnal Emissions catalogue with Invocation of the Beast Gods from 1989, which, going off the credits, appears to be a Nigel Ayers solo work. Now, all the track names on this one are in Latin. I'll try my best with the pronunciations, though I know for a fact that some will be wrong, so please cut me some slack here. Okay, so Bestiae Clamor opens the show with overlapping minimalist loops of violin sawing and vocal chanting. The piece sitting in a curious netherworld between being ecstatic and sinister, and setting the scene well for what's to come. Next, Caeli Piscis consists of suitably subaquatic, reverbed piano and bell tinklings, which anticipate the similarly eerie ambient sections on Current 93's mid-90s masterpiece, Of Ruin or Some Blazing Star, the whole thing getting dronier as it progresses. For some reason, the next two pieces are indexed together. First up, Fons opens with a heavenly synth loop in the vein of late 70s Eno, which gradually gets hazier and more smeared out as it's joined by gentle white noise electronics and bird calls, the piece eventually taking on a sighing, weary, Sovi So-So era cluster vibe. Then Pulveris Fossa drifts by on a reedy organ drone with vocal loops, possibly of Aleister Crowley, which are processed into a distant gurgle alongside assorted metallic delay noises. Parva Anguilla follows in a similar manner with a short, muffled vocal loop backed by further reedy droning, whilst Talpa Cicada comprises mostly of Morse code blipping and some vague, wobbly piano loopage off in the distance, which gradually comes into focus as the piece winds on. Towards the back end of the CD, Parvum Miraculum reprises the vocal loop from the previous track, though here it's a bit brighter sounding, at least before it's gradually subsumed by a sinister buzzing drone and the sound of a ticking clock. Delphin Tintinnabulum, named partially after a type of wind chime used in ancient Roman times, again lives up to its title, offering up layers of clanging singing bowls, bit-crushed ambience, and a loop of heavily processed cackling. The penultimate piece, Lenis Tinnitus, acts almost like an ambient dub reworking of Fons from earlier, with fizzing white noise hovering over a processed synth loop. Then Ferocitas closes things on a bright note, with sunny string loops, both bowed and plucked, subjected to more of that heavy bit crushing. Okay, so as with The World Is My Womb, Invocation of the Beast Gods is another one that sounded a bit sparse and unhappening at first. On this occasion, though, it definitely has a handful of tracks that don't really do very much any way you look at them, and overall it's easily my least favourite of the four I'm discussing today. But again, if you're in the mood for some occultist, ritualistic, esoteric vibes, then this is nice to chuck on for a quick fix, if nothing else. Right, so that's what I have so far by Nocturnal Emissions. I've definitely got a lot of work to do filling in the gaps, and I'll be sure to report back if I do manage to track anything else down. But yeah, in the meantime, these four certainly make for an interesting little snapshot of their output. That said, I do also own the classic and only solo album by Caroline Kay, Now Wait for Last Year, though it's tucked away in a box somewhere, so I'll have to cover that in a later video. As many of you will be aware, sadly, Caroline passed away in 2008, aged just 51. Though by the looks of things, Nigel Ayers remains active, regularly putting out new works via his Earthly Delights imprint. Okay, that's it for this episode. I hope it's been enjoyable. As ever, if you want to hear further musings on music and films, then please check out the archive for more content, and please hit subscribe to be kept up to date on the channel's activity. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you again soon on the Acid Trash Jamboree.